双语音标领航，注音阅读启蒙，叶兴阳有声读物。
A Woman of 30 by Honoré de Balzac. Translated by Ellen Marriage. Dedication to Louis Boulanger, painter. A woman of 30. Early mistakes. It was a Sunday morning in the beginning of April 1813, a morning which gave promise of one of those bright days when Parisians, for the first time in the year, behold dry pavements underfoot and a cloudless sky overhead. It was not yet noon when a luxurious cabriolet, drawn by two spirited horses, turned out of the Rue de Castiglione into the Rue de Rivoli, and drew up behind a row of carriages standing before the newly opened barrier halfway down the Terrasse de Feuillants. The owner of the carriage looked anxious and out of health. The thin hair on his sallow temples, turning gray already, gave a look of premature age to his face. He flung the reins to a servant who followed on horseback, and alighted to take in his arms a young girl whose dainty beauty had already attracted the eyes of loungers on the terrace. The little lady, standing upon the carriage step, graciously submitted to be taken by the waist, putting an arm round the neck of her guide, who set her down upon the pavement without so much as ruffling the trimming of her green rep dress. No lover would have been so careful. The stranger could only be the father of the young girl, who took his arm familiarly, without a word of thanks, and hurried him into the garden of the Tuileries. The old father noted the wondering stare which some of the young men gave the couple, and the sad expression left his face for a moment. Although he had long since reached the time of life when a man is fain to be content with such illusory delights as vanity bestows, he began to smile. "They think you are my wife," he said in the young lady's ear, and he held himself erect and walked with slow steps, which filled his daughter with despair. He seemed to take up the coquette's part for her. Perhaps of the two, he was the more gratified by the curious glances directed at those little feet, shod with plum-colored prunella, at the dainty figure outlined by a low-cut bodice, filled in with an embroidered chemisette, which only partially concealed the girlish throat. Her dress was lifted by her movements as she walked, giving glimpses higher than the shoes of delicately molded outlines beneath open-work silk stockings. More than one of the idlers turned and passed the pair again, to admire or to catch a second glimpse of the young face, about which the brown tresses played. There was a glow in its white and red, partly reflected from the rose-colored satin lining of her fashionable bonnet, partly due to the eagerness and impatience which sparkled in every feature. A mischievous sweetness lighted up the beautiful, almond-shaped dark eyes, bathed in liquid brightness, shaded by the long lashes and curving arch of eyebrow. Life and youth displayed their treasures in the petulant face and in the gracious outlines of the bust unspoiled even by the fashion of the day, which brought the girdle under the breast. The young lady herself appeared to be insensible to admiration. Her eyes were fixed in a sort of anxiety on the palace of the Tuileries, the goal, doubtless, of her petulant promenade. It wanted but 15 minutes of noon, yet even at that early hour several women in gala dress were coming away from the Tuileries, not without backward glances at the gates and pouting looks of discontent, as if they regretted the lateness of the arrival which had cheated them of a longed-for spectacle. Chance carried a few words let fall by one of these disappointed fair ones to the ears of the charming stranger, and put her in a more than common uneasiness. The elderly man watched the signs of impatience and apprehension which flitted across his companion's pretty face with interest, rather than amusement, in his eyes, observing her with a close and careful attention, which perhaps could only be prompted by some afterthought in the depths of a father's mind. It was the 13th Sunday of the year 1813. In 2 days' time Napoleon was to set out upon the disastrous campaign in which he was to lose first Bessieres, and then Duroc. He was to win the memorable battles of Lutzen and Botzen, to see himself treacherously deserted by Austria, Saxony, Bavaria, and Bernadotte, and to dispute the dreadful field of Leipzig. The magnificent review commanded for that day by the Emperor was to be the last of so many which had long drawn forth the admiration of Paris and of foreign visitors. For the last time, the old guard would execute their scientific military maneuvers with a pomp and precision which sometimes amazed the giant himself. Napoleon was nearly ready for his duel with Europe. It was a sad sentiment which brought a brilliant and curious throng to the Tuileries. Each mind seemed to foresee the future. Perhaps, too, in every mind another thought was dimly present. How that, in the future, when the heroic age of France should have taken the half-fabulous color with which it is tinged for us today, men's imaginations would more than once seek to retrace the picture of the pageant which they were assembled to behold. Do let us go more quickly. Father, I can hear the drums, the young girl said, and in a half-teasing, half-coaxing manner she urged her companion forward. The troops are marching into the Tuileries, said he. Or, marching out of it, everybody is coming away, she answered in childish vexation, which drew a smile from her father. The review only begins at 12:30, he said. He had fallen half behind his impetuous daughter. It might have been supposed that she meant to hasten their progress by a movement of her right arm, for it swung like an oar blade through the water. In her impatience, she had crushed her handkerchief into a ball in her tiny, well-gloved fingers. Now and then the old man smiled, but the smiles were succeeded by an anxious look which crossed his withered face and saddened it. In his love for the fair young girl by his side, he was as fain to exalt the present moment as to dread the future. She is happy today. Will her happiness last? He seemed to ask himself, for the old are somewhat prone to foresee their own sorrows in the future of the young. Father and daughter reached the peristyle under the tower, where the tricolor flag was still waving. But as they passed under the arch by which people came and went between the gardens of the Tuileries and the Place du Carrousel, the sentries on guard called out sternly, "No admittance this way." By standing on tiptoe, the young girl contrived to catch a glimpse of a crowd of well-dressed women, thronging either side of the old marble arcade along which the emperor was to pass. "We were too late in starting, Father. You can see that quite well." A little piteous pout revealed the immense importance which she attached to the sight of this particular review. "Very well, Julie, let us go away. You dislike a crush. Do let us stay, Father. Even here I may catch a glimpse of the emperor. He might die during this campaign, and then I should never have seen him." Her father shuddered at the selfish speech. There were tears in the girl's voice. He looked at her, and thought that he saw tears beneath her lowered eyelids, tears caused not so much by the disappointment as by one of the troubles of early youth, a secret easily guessed by an old father. Suddenly Julie's face flushed, and she uttered an exclamation. Neither her father nor the sentinels understood the meaning of the cry, but an officer within the barrier, who sprang across the court towards the staircase, heard it, and turned abruptly at the sound. He went to the arcade by the gardens of the Tuileries, and recognized the young lady who had been hidden for a moment by the tall bearskin caps of the grenadiers. He set aside in favor of the pair the order which he himself had given. Then, taking no heed of the murmurings of the fashionable crowd seated under the arcade, he gently drew the enraptured child towards him. I am no longer surprised at her vexation and enthusiasm. If Uou are in waiting, the old man said with a half-mocking, half-serious glance at the officer. If you want a good position, Aime le Duc, the young man answered. We must not spend any time in talking. The emperor does not like to be kept waiting, and the Grand Marshal has sent me to announce our readiness. As he spoke, he had taken Julie's arm with a certain air of old acquaintance, and drew her rapidly in the direction of the Place du Carrousel. Julie was astonished at the sight. An immense crowd was penned up in a narrow space, shut in between the grey walls of the palace and the limits marked out by chains round the great sanded squares in the midst of the courtyard of the Tuileries. The cordon of sentries posted to keep a clear passage for the emperor and his staff had great difficulty in keeping back the eager humming swarm of human beings. Is it going to be a very fine sight? Julie asked. She was radiant now. Pray take care, cried her guide, and seizing Julie by the waist, he lifted her up with as much vigor as rapidity and set her down beside a pillar. but for his prompt action, his gazing kinswoman would have come into collision with the hindquarters of a white horse which Napoleon's Mameluke held by the bridle. The animal in its trappings of green velvet and gold stood almost under the arcade, some 10 paces behind the rest of the horses in readiness for the emperor's staff. The young officer placed the father and daughter in front of the crowd in the first space to the right, and recommended them by a sign to the 2 veteran grenadiers on either side. Then he went on his way into the palace. A look of great joy and happiness had succeeded to his horror-struck expression when the horse backed. Julie had given his hand a mysterious pressure. Had she meant to thank him for the little service he had done her? Or did she tell him, "After all, I shall really see you"? She bent her head quite graciously in response to the respectful bow by which the officer took leave of them before he vanished. The old man stood a little behind his daughter. He looked grave. He seemed to have left the 2 young people together for some purpose of his own. And now he furtively watched the girl, trying to lull her into false security by appearing to give his whole attention to the magnificent sight in the Place du Carrousel. When Julie's eyes turned to her father with the expression of a schoolboy before his master, he answered her glance by a gay, kindly smile, but his own keen eyes had followed the officer under the arcade, and nothing of all that passed was lost upon him. "What a grand sight," said Julie in a low voice, as she pressed her father's hand. And indeed the pomp and picturesqueness of the spectacle in the Place du Carrousel drew the same exclamation from thousands upon thousands of spectators, all agape with wonder. Another array of sightseers, as tightly packed as the ranks behind the old noble and his daughter, filled the narrow strip of pavement by the railings which crossed the Place du Carrousel from side to side in a line parallel with the Palace of the Tuileries. The dense, living mass, variegated by the colors of the women's dresses, traced out a bold line across the center of the Place du Carrousel, filling in the 4th side of a vast parallelogram, surrounded on 3 sides by the Palace of the Tuileries itself. Within the precincts thus railed off stood the regiments of the Old Guard about to be passed in review, drawn up opposite the palace in imposing blue columns, 10 ranks in depth. Without and beyond in the Place du Carrousel stood several regiments likewise drawn up in parallel lines, ready to march in through the arch in the center, the Triumphal Arch, where the bronze horses of St. Mark from Venice used to stand in those days. At either end, by the Galeries du Louvre, the regimental bands were stationed, masked by the Polish lancers then on duty. The greater part of the vast gravelled space was empty as an arena, ready for the evolutions of those silent masses disposed with the symmetry of military art. The sunlight blazed back from 10,000 bayonets in thin points of flame. The breeze ruffled the men's helmet plumes till they swayed like the crests of forest trees before a gale. The mute glittering ranks of veterans were full of bright contrasting colors, thanks to their different uniforms, weapons, accoutrements, and aiguillettes. And the whole great picture, that miniature battlefield before the combat, was framed by the majestic towering walls of the Tuileries, which officers and men seemed to rival in their immobility. Involuntarily the spectator made the comparison between the walls of men and the walls of stone. The spring sunlight, flooding white masonry reared but yesterday and buildings centuries old, shone full likewise upon thousands of bronzed faces, each one with its own tale of perils past, each one gravely expectant of perils to come. The colonels of the regiments came and went alone before the ranks of heroes, and behind the masses of troops, checkered with blue and silver and gold and purple, the curious could discern the tricolor pennons on the lances of some 6 indefatigable Polish cavalry, rushing about like shepherd's dogs in charge of a flock, caracoling up and down between the troops and the crowd, to keep the gazers within their proper bounds. But for this slight flutter of movement, the whole scene might have been taking place in the courtyard of the Palace of the Sleeping Beauty. The very spring breeze, ruffling up the long fur on the grenadiers' bearskins, bore witness to the men's immobility, as the smothered murmur of the crowd emphasized their silence. Now and again the jingling of Chinese bells, or a chance blow to a big drum, woke the reverberating echoes of the imperial palace with a sound like the far-off rumblings of thunder. An indescribable, unmistakable enthusiasm was manifest in the expectancy of the multitude. France was about to take farewell of Napoleon on the eve of a campaign of which the meanest citizen foresaw the perils. The existence of the French Empire was at stake to be, or not to be. The whole citizen population seemed to be as much inspired with this thought as that other armed population standing in serried and silent ranks in the enclosed space, with the eagles and the genius of Napoleon hovering above them. Those very soldiers were the hope of France, her last drop of blood, and this accounted for not a little of the anxious interest of the scene. Most of the gazers in the crowd had bidden farewell, perhaps farewell forever, to the men who made up the rank and file of the battalions, and even those most hostile to the emperor, in their hearts, put up fervent prayers to heaven for the glory of France, and those most weary of the struggle with the rest of Europe had left their hatreds behind as they passed in under the triumphal arch. They too felt that in the hour of danger Napoleon meant France herself. The clock of the Tuileries struck the half-hour. In a moment the hum of the crowd ceased. The silence was so deep that you might have heard a child speak. The old noble and his daughter, wholly intent, seeming to live only by their eyes, caught a distinct sound of spurs and clank of swords echoing up under the sonorous peristyle. And suddenly there appeared a short, somewhat stout figure in a green uniform, white trousers, and riding boots, a man wearing on his head a cocked hat well nigh as magically potent as its wearer. The broad red ribbon of the Legion of Honor rose and fell on his breast, and a short sword hung at his side. At one and the same moment the man was seen by all eyes in all parts of the square. Immediately the drums beat a salute. Both bands struck up a martial refrain, caught and repeated like a fugue by every instrument from the thinnest flutes to the largest drum. The clangor of that call to arms thrilled through every soul. The colors dropped, and the men presented arms. One unanimous rhythmical movement shaking every bayonet from the foremost front near the palace to the last rank in the Place du Carrousel. The words of command sped from line to line like echoes. The whole enthusiastic multitude sent up a shout of "Long live the Emperor!" Everything shook, quivered, and thrilled at last. Napoleon had mounted his horse. It was his movement that had put life into those silent masses of men. The dumb instruments had found a voice at his coming. The eagles and the colors had obeyed the same impulse which had brought emotion into all faces. The very walls of the high galleries of the old palace seemed to cry aloud, "Long live the Emperor!" There was something preternatural about it. It was magic at work. A counterfeit presentment of the power of God, or rather it was a fugitive image of a reign itself, so fugitive. And hey, the center of such love, such enthusiasm and devotion, and so many prayers. He for whom the sun had driven the clouds from the sky was sitting there on his horse, 3 paces in front of his golden squadron, with the Grand Marshal on his left, and the Marshallin waiting on his right. Amid all the outburst of enthusiasm at his presence, not a feature of his face appeared to alter.
Oh, yes.
At Wagram, in the thick of the firing, on the field of Borodino, among the dead, always as cool as a cucumber hay is, said the grenadier, in answer to the questions with which the young girl plied him. For a moment Julie was absorbed in the contemplation of that face, so quiet in the security of conscious power. The emperor noticed Mlle de Chatillonist, and leaned to make some brief remark to Duroc, which drew a smile from the Grand Marshal. Then the review began. If hitherto the young lady's attention had been divided between Napoleon's impassive face and the blue, red, and green ranks of troops, from this time forth she was wholly intent upon a young officer moving among the lines as they performed their swift symmetrical evolutions. She watched him gallop with tireless activity to and from the group, where the plainly dressed Napoleon shone conspicuous. The officer rode a splendid black horse. His handsome sky-blue uniform marked him out amid the variegated multitude, as one of the emperor's orderly staff officers. His gold lace glittered in the sunshine which lighted up the aigrette on his tall, narrow shako, so that the gazer might have compared him to a will-o'-the-wisp, or to a visible spirit emanating from the emperor to infuse movement into those battalions whose swaying bayonets flashed into flames. For, at a mere glance from his eyes, they broke and gathered again, surging to and fro like the waves in a bay, or again swept before him like the long ridges of high-crested wave which the vexed ocean directs against the shore. When the maneuvers were over, the officer galloped back at full speed, pulled up his horse, and awaited orders. He was not 10 paces from Julie as he stood before the emperor, much as General Rapp stands in Gerard's Battle of Austerlitz. The young girl could behold her lover in all his soldierly splendor. Colonel Victor d'Aiglemont, barely 30 years of age, was tall, slender, and well-made. His well-proportioned figure never showed to better advantage than now as he exerted his strength to hold in the restive animal, whose back seemed to curve gracefully to the rider's weight. His brown masculine face possessed the indefinable charm of perfectly regular features combined with youth. The fiery eyes under the broad forehead, shaded by thick eyebrows and long lashes, looked like white ovals bordered by an outline of black. His nose had the delicate curve of an eagle's beak. The sinuous lines of the inevitable black mustache enhanced the crimson of the lips. The brown and tawny shades which overspread the wide, high-colored cheeks told a tale of unusual vigor, and his whole face bore the impress of dashing courage. He was the very model which French artists seek today for the typical hero of imperial France. The horse which he rode was covered with sweat. The animal's quivering head denoted the last degree of restiveness. His hind hoofs were set down wide apart, and exactly in a line. He shook his long, thick tail to the wind. In his fidelity to his master, he seemed to be a visible presentment of that master's devotion to the emperor. Julie saw her lover watching intently for the emperor's glances, and felt a momentary pang of jealousy, for, as yet he had not given her a look. Suddenly, at a word from his sovereign, Victor gripped his horse's flanks and set out at a gallop. But the animal took fright at a shadow cast by a post, shied, backed, and reared up so suddenly that his rider was all but thrown off. Julie cried out. Her face grew white. People looked at her curiously, but she saw no one. Her eyes were fixed upon the too meddlesome beast. The officer gave the horse a sharp admonitory cut with the whip, and galloped off with Napoleon's order. Julie was so absorbed, so dizzy with sights and sounds, that unconsciously she clung to her father's arms so tightly that he could read her thoughts by the varying pressure of her fingers. When Victor was all but flung out of the saddle, she clutched her father with a convulsive grip as if she herself were in danger of falling, and the old man looked at his daughter's telltale face with dark and painful anxiety, pity, jealousy. Something even of regret stole across every drawn and wrinkled line of mouth and brow. When he saw the unwonted light in Julie's eyes, when that cry broke from her, when the convulsive grasp of her fingers drew away the veil and put him in possession of her secret, then with that revelation of her love there came surely some swift revelation of the future. Mournful forebodings could be read in his own face. Julie's soul seemed at that moment to have passed into the officer's being. A torturing thought more cruel than any previous dread contracted the old man's pain-worn features, as he saw the glance of understanding that passed between the soldier and Julie. The girl's eyes were wet, her cheeks glowed with unwonted color. Her father turned abruptly and led her away into the garden of the Tuileries.
Why,
father, she cried. There are still the regiments in the Place du Carrousel to be passed in review.
No, child.
All the troops are marching out. I think you are mistaken, father. D'Aiglemont surely told them to advance. But I feel ill, my child, and I do not care to stay. Julie could readily believe the words when she glanced at his face. He looked quite worn out by his fatherly anxieties. Are you feeling very ill? She asked indifferently. Her mind was so full of other thoughts. Every day is a reprieve for me. Is it not? Returned her father. Now do you mean to make me miserable again by talking about your death? I was in such spirits. Do pray get rid of those horrid gloomy ideas of yours. The father heaved a sigh.
Ah,
spoiled child, he cried. The best hearts are sometimes very cruel. We devote our whole lives to you. You are our one thought. We plan for your welfare. Sacrifice our tastes to your whims. Idolize you. Give the very blood in our veins for you. And all this is nothing, is it? Alas. Yes. You take it all as a matter of course. If we would always have your smiles and your disdainful love, we should need the power of God in heaven. Then comes another, a lover, a husband, and steals away your heart. Julie looked in amazement at her father. He walked slowly along, and there was no light in the eyes which he turned upon her. You hide yourself even from us, he continued, but, perhaps, also you hide yourself from yourself. What do you mean by that? Father, I think that you have secrets from me. Julie, you love. He went on quickly, as he saw the color rise to her face.
oh,
I hoped that you would stay with your old father until he died. I hoped to keep you with me, still radiant and happy, to admire you as you were, but so lately. So long as I knew nothing of your future, I could believe in a happy lot for you, but now I cannot possibly take away with me a hope of happiness for your life. For you love the colonel even more than the cousin. I can no longer doubt it. And why should I be forbidden to love him? Asked Julie, with lively curiosity in her face.
ah,
My Julie, you would not understand me, sighed the father. Tell me. All the same, said Julie, with an involuntary petulant gesture. Very well.
child.